The diplomatic suite assigned to the human delegation was comfortable, but clearly designed to remind visitors of their place in the galactic order. The furniture was sized for beings much larger than humans. The lighting was calibrated for eyes that saw different spectrums, and the windows looked out on the endless expanse of council space, as if to say, "Look how small you are." Sarah did not care about any of it. She sat at a table covered with data pads, empty coffee cups, and the scattered remains of protein bars, while her team worked through the night reading every word of the 3,000-page treaty. Found another one. Called out Dr. Kim Minji, the delegation's legal expert, her eyes red from hours of staring at screens. Sarah walked over and looked at the section. Minji had highlighted Article 7847. Subsection 12. Any genetic research conducted by provisional species must receive advance approval from the Council Bureau of Biological Affairs, and failure to comply will result in immediate sanctions, including but not limited to the forced sterilization of research facilities. Forced sterilization, Minji repeated, shaking her head. They can destroy our labs if they don't like what we're studying. Sarah made a note and moved on to the next station, where Jinho was wrestling with the technical section's ship designs. Jinho reported without looking up. Every vessel we build becomes shared intellectual property of the Council, and they can demand copies of our blueprints at any time for any reason. What about existing ships? Sarah asked, grandfathered in for 20 years. Then they become Council property too. Sarah felt a headache building behind her eyes, but pushed through it at the far end of the room. Commander Bae Sung-hoon, the military advisor, was pacing back and forth with a fury he was barely controlling. The relocation clause, he said when Sarah approached. Do you understand what they're really saying? Tell me. Sung-hoon pulled up a star map on the main display. Human colonies are here. Here and here, he said, pointing to 14 glowing dots scattered across a region of space. 3 of them sit on resource-rich systems that the Council has been eyeing for centuries, and under this treaty, they can vote to move our people out whenever they decide those systems are strategically important. Move them where? Wherever they want, Sung-hoon growled. Could be a frozen moon on the edge of nowhere. Could be a station like this one, where we live under their constant watch. Doesn't matter as long as they vote for it. Sarah looked at the map and saw not just stars, but the homes of millions of human beings who had worked and sacrificed to build new lives among the stars. How long before they call a vote like that? She asked. Best guess, 5 years, maybe 10, Sung-hoon answered. They'll wait until we're dependent on their trade networks. Until we've reduced our fleet like they want. Until we can't fight back even if we wanted to. The room fell silent. Everyone understood what they were. Looking at now, this wasn't a treaty of friendship. This was a slow conquest dressed up in diplomatic language. Sarah walked to the window and looked out at the station spinning slowly. Against the stars, somewhere out there, billions of humans were waiting to hear what would happen. Whether they would join the great galactic civilization or be left alone in the dark. She thought about her grandmother, who had survived a war that killed millions and still found the strength to build a new life. She thought about the colonists on distant worlds who had crossed the void in ships that were barely held together by hope and determination. She thought about every human who had ever looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there. Open a channel to Earth, she said finally. The connection took several minutes to establish, bouncing through relay stations across hundreds of light years. But eventually, the face of President Chen Wei appeared on the screen. Ambassador Yoon, the president said, his expression serious. What did you find? Sarah took a deep breath and told him everything. She explained the restrictions on expansion, the military limitations, the forced technology sharing, and the relocation clauses. She described the way the council members had looked at the human delegation like children who needed to be guided or like animals that needed to be tamed when she finished. The president was quiet for a long time. "What is your recommendation?" he asked at last. Sarah looked around at her team and saw the same answer in every pair of eyes. "We cannot accept these terms," she said firmly. "If we sign this treaty, we sign away everything that makes us who we are. And in a generation or two, there won't be a humanity anymore. Just another provisional species waiting for permission to exist." President Chun nodded slowly. "The Congress has been watching your reports," he said. "And we've already held an emergency session. And the vote was unanimous." "What was the decision?" The president leaned forward, and for a moment, Sarah saw not a politician but a man who loved his people with every fiber of his being. "We decline," he said simply. "We thank them for the offer, and we walk away." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. "Understood. Mr. President, Ambassador," Chun added before cutting the connection. "Make sure they understand that we're not asking for their approval." The next morning, the human delegation walked back into the council chamber. The seats were even more crowded than before, as word had spread that the young species from Earth would give their answer today. Beings from across the galaxy had come to watch another civilization accept the inevitable. High Arbiter Voronthal floated above the chamber, his crystalline form shimmering with anticipation. "Ambassador Yoon," he announced warmly, "we welcome you back. And we trust that your government has had time to appreciate the tremendous opportunity we have offered." Sarah walked to the central platform and looked up at the assembled representatives of 47 species. She saw curiosity, condescension, and in a few faces, something that might have been hope. "High Arbiter," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "On behalf of the United Terran Congress and the 8 billion citizens of Earth and her colonies, I am authorized to deliver our formal response to your generous invitation." She paused, and the silence was so complete that she could hear the hum of the station's engines. Far below, "We respectfully decline," for 3 full seconds. Nothing happened. Then the chamber erupted in chaos. Voices shouted in 100 languages. Some demanding translation, some demanding explanation, some simply expressing disbelief. Voranthal's form flickered wildly, colors racing across his crystalline surface like lightning in a storm. "You cannot decline," he said, his musical voice now sharp with confusion. "No species has ever declined." Sarah remained perfectly calm. "There's a first time for everything," she replied. Ambassador Yoon Sira, now 83 years old with hair turned completely white and a body that needed assistance to walk long distances, stood at the window of her home on New Seoul and watched ships crossing the sky above. 62 human worlds now orbited stars that council maps had marked as unreachable trade routes connected humanity with a dozen species that had never bent their knee to. Vorenthal's ancient order research stations pushed the boundaries of science in directions that council bureaucracy would never have permitted, and today, something was happening that would change the galaxy forever. "Ambassador," said a young aide approaching with careful respect, "the council delegation has arrived at the border station." Sarah smiled at the word ambassador, even though she had officially retired 15 years ago. Some titles stuck no matter what paperwork said. "Help me to the transport," she replied. "I want to see this for myself." The border station was a massive structure built jointly by humanity and the Cathari. At the edge of the boundary expanse, it served as a meeting point between council space and what the news feeds had started calling free space, a name that made council officials grind their teeth every time they heard it. The station was crowded today. Representatives from the Human Trade Confederation had gathered alongside their Cathari. Vaughn and Wanderer allies to witness a moment that many had thought would never come at the center of the main hall. A delegation of council species waited with expressions ranging from nervous to resentful to cautiously hopeful. High Arbiter Vorenthal was not among them. The crystalline being had finally retired 5 years earlier, unable to adapt to a galaxy that no longer worked the way he had always believed it should. His replacement, a younger Vorenthal named Crystallith, stood at the front of the council delegation with a document in her gleaming hands. President Chen, Crystallith said, addressing the leader of the Human Trade Confederation on behalf of the Galactic Council, I present this formal request. She held out the document. President Chen Howren, grandson of the man who had authorized humanity's departure 30 years ago, stepped forward and accepted it with both hands in the traditional gesture of respect. The Galactic Council formally requests admission to the Human Trade Confederation as an associate member. Crystallith continued, and every word seemed to cost her visible effort. We ask for fair trade access, mutual defense agreements, and cultural exchange programs. She paused. To be treated as equals. A murmur ran through the hall. 30 years ago, the Council had offered humanity a leash disguised as protection. Today, the Council was asking humanity for the very thing they had once refused to give. President Chun read through the document carefully, taking his time, making the Council delegation wait just as humanity had once been made to wait. Finally, he looked up. We will give this request the serious consideration it deserves, he said in measured tones. Our Confederation values cooperation with all who approach us in good faith. Crystallith bowed her crystalline head. That is all we ask. The formal ceremony continued with speeches and handshakes and the exchange of diplomatic gifts. But Sierra found her attention wandering to a different part of the hall. Scareth was there. The old Veth ambassador had lived far longer than anyone expected. Kept alive by sheer stubbornness, according to those who knew him. His scales had faded to almost pure gray, and he moved with the careful slowness of extreme age. But his eyes were still sharp. Sierra made her way through the crowd until she reached him. Ambassador Scareth, she said. Ambassador Yoon, he replied. And the ghost of a smile crossed his ancient face. I wondered if you would be here. I wouldn't miss this for anything. They stood together in silence for a moment. Two old beings who had witnessed history unfolding. I have a question, Sierra said finally. If you'll indulge me, ask. Back then, in the council chamber, you warned your colleagues about us, Sierra recalled. You told them we were good at finding ways around obstacles. But they didn't listen. They rarely did, Scareth acknowledged. Why did you try to warn them? The Veth was quiet for a long time, his eyes watching the council delegation as they navigated a room full of species they had once dismissed as impossible. Because I am old, he said at last, and I have seen many young species come before the council. And I have watched them all submit because they believed they had no choice. He turned to look at Sierra directly. You were the first to look at the council and see what it truly was. He continued, not a protector, not a guide, but a cage made of comfortable lies. And you chose freedom, even when freedom meant uncertainty and danger, and the very real possibility of failure. His ancient voice grew soft. I warned them because I wanted to see what would happen if a species was brave enough to say no. And what do you think now? Scareth made a sound that might have been a laugh. I think the council spent 12,000 years telling itself that its way was the only way, he answered. And you proved them wrong in 30, and now they have to learn to live in a galaxy where walking away was always an option. He reached out and placed one weather claw gently on Sarah's arm. Thank you for that, he said simply. Sarah covered his claw with her own hand. Thank you for believing we could do it. Later that evening, after the ceremonies were finished and the delegates had departed, Sierra sat alone in her quarters aboard the station, A datapad rested in her lap, displaying the Council's formal request for membership. She read through it one more time, noting the careful language, the humble tone, the absence of any demands or conditions. Then she set the datapad aside and looked out the window at the stars, somewhere out there. Human children were growing up on worlds that had never been seen by Council eyes. They were learning to dream without limits, to explore without permission, to build futures that belonged entirely to them. And somewhere out there, other species were watching humanity and wondering if they too could find the courage to choose their own path. Sarah smiled 30 years ago. She had stood in a council chamber and spoken 3 words that changed everything. We respectfully decline. It had been a gamble, a leap of faith into unknown darkness. And there had been moments when she feared they had made a terrible mistake. But looking at the galaxy now, at the free confederation of equals that humanity had helped to build, she knew that walking away had been the best decision her species had ever made. The stars belonged to everyone brave enough to reach for them. Humanity had just been the first to remember that. Across 14 colony worlds, human families packed their belongings into cargo containers and said goodbye to homes they had spent years building. Children asked their parents why they had to leave, and the parents struggled to find answers that would make sense to young minds on council stations and trading posts. Human merchants closed their shops and human workers finished their contracts while alien neighbors watched with a mixture of confusion and pity. The galaxy had never seen anything like it, a species walking away from the greatest civilization in history, turning its back on thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and protection, all because of pride. That was what most council members believed anyway. They told each other that the humans would come crawling back within a year, begging for whatever scraps of membership the council might offer, and everyone would have a good laugh about the foolish young species that thought it could survive alone. But the humans did not crawl back. Instead, they worked on Earth. Scientists gathered in massive research facilities to tackle the problem of the boundary expanse. They studied every piece of data ever collected about that deadly region, every failed expedition, every theory that had been proposed and dismissed. They argued and debated and tested and failed and tested again. Dr. Park Eun-ji, a physicist who had spent her career studying spatial anomalies, made the breakthrough on a Thursday afternoon when she was so tired she could barely see straight. "We've been thinking about it wrong," she announced to her exhausted team. "We keep trying to go through the expanse like it's a storm to be weathered. But what if we think of it as a river instead?" "A river?" asked her colleague. "Rivers have currents," Eun-ji explained, her words coming faster as the idea took shape. "Strong currents that can destroy anything trying to fight against them. But if you understand the currents, if you can map them and predict them, you can ride them instead." Within 3 months, humanity had developed new navigation protocols based on Eun-ji's river theory. The gravitational currents of the expanse were not random as everyone had believed, but followed patterns that could be predicted. With enough data and processing power, human ships would not fight the expanse. They would dance with it. Meanwhile, the human exodus continued. Colony ships that had been built for settlement were converted into arcs capable of carrying thousands of people across unknown distances. Engineers worked around the clock to reinforce hulls, upgrade engines, and install the new navigation systems. Families gathered at departure points, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. Sarah watched the first convoy depart from orbit around New Singapore, one of the largest human colonies. 30 ships carrying nearly 100,000 people into the darkness beyond council space. "Do you think they'll make it?" Jinho asked. Standing beside her at the observation deck, Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I have to believe they will," she finally answered. "Because if they don't, everything we've done means nothing." The council watched too. though they tried to pretend they weren't interested. High Arbiter Vonthal received reports every day about the human movements. And every day he expected to hear that the fools had finally seen reason instead. He heard something that made his crystalline form pulse with irritation. Human ships were successfully entering the boundary expanse and not being destroyed. Impossible, declared the Marvani mathematicians. Clearly not, replied Scarith with something that might have been satisfaction. By the end of the first year, all human citizens had been evacuated from Council space. The last ship to leave was a small transport, carrying the diplomatic team that had been handling the final arrangements. Syrah was not on that ship. She had returned to Earth months earlier to help coordinate the exodus. But she watched the departure through a real-time feed and felt a weight lift from her shoulders. They had done it. They had actually done it, but the Council was not finished as human presence disappeared from their space. Whispers began circulating among member species about what the humans might be finding on the other side of the expanse. Some whispers spoke of rich new worlds waiting to be claimed. Others spoke of dangers that would surely destroy the upstart species. And a few whispered something that worried the Council leadership far more than anything else. What if the humans found friends out there? The answer came in the second year. Human explorers made contact with the Cathari, a species of aquatic beings who had fled Council space 3,000 years ago. After refusing to submit to the same treaty humanity had rejected, Cathari had built a small but thriving civilization in the systems beyond the expanse, and they welcomed humanity with open arms and practical assistance. Then came the Vaughn, a race of silicon-based beings who had never had contact with the Council at all because they existed in a part of space the Council had believed was empty. The Vaughn were curious and friendly and fascinated by human music, which they experienced as complex mathematical patterns. Then came the Wanderers, a nomadic species that traveled between galaxies and had stories to tell about civilizations far older and stranger than anything the Council had ever imagined. Word of these discoveries filtered back to Council space through channels that could not be entirely controlled. Merchants who had worked with humans, scientists who had collaborated on research projects, and diplomats who had formed personal connections all heard rumors and passed them along, and something began to change. Species that had accepted Council membership without question started asking why they had never been told about what lay beyond the expanse. Species that had chafed under Council restrictions started wondering if there might be another way, and High Arbiter Varnthal, watching his carefully maintained order begin to fray at the edges, sent message after message to the human government requesting renewed negotiations. Syrah read each message, considered it carefully, and sent back polite acknowledgments that said nothing at all. Humanity was building something new out in the darkness, and they did not need the Council's permission to do it. The chaos in the Council chamber continued for several minutes while Syrah stood motionless at the center of the storm. Delegates shouted at each other across the vast room, their voices a cacophony of clicks, whistles, growls, and sound that human ears could barely process. Some were demanding to know if the translation had been correct. Others were laughing at what they assumed was a joke, and still others sat in stunned silence, trying to understand what had just happened. High Arbiter Varnthal raised one crystalline arm, and slowly, painfully, order returned to the chamber. Ambassador Yoon, he said, his voice now cold and sharp, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. I do not think you understand the situation. I understand perfectly, Syrah replied without hesitation. Then you must understand that declining is not truly an option, Varnthal continued. Species that are not members of the Council cannot operate freely in Council space. cannot access our trade networks, and cannot expect protection from hostile entities. He leaned forward, and his form cast prismatic shadows across the chamber floor. The galaxy is not a safe place for those who stand alone. Sierra had prepared for this moment. She had rehearsed the words 100 times in her head during the sleepless night, and now they came as easily as breathing. High Arbiter, we appreciate your concern for our well-being, she said calmly, and in recognition of the difficulties you have described, the United Terran Congress has authorized me to announce the following. She pulled out a datapad and read from it with the same measured tone she had used in 1,000 negotiations before. All human vessels currently operating in Council space will complete their business and depart within 30 standard days. All human citizens residing on Council worlds will be offered transportation back to Earth or to human colony worlds within 6 standard months. And all human trade agreements with Council members will be honored until their natural expiration and then terminated. The chamber fell silent again. But this was a different kind of silence. This was the silence of beings who were beginning to realize that the humans were not bluffing. Furthermore, Sierra continued, humanity will establish new trade routes and colonial ventures in territories beyond Council jurisdiction. And we will seek relationships with species and civilizations that are not part of your organization. A ripple of murmuring passed through the seats beyond Council. Jurisdiction was a phrase that meant nothing to most of the delegates because, as far as they knew, there was nothing beyond Council jurisdiction except empty space and the boundary expanse. The boundary expanse was a vast region of unstable space filled with gravity wells, radiation storms, and spatial anomalies that had claimed every expedition ever sent to explore it. No ship that entered the expanse had ever returned. One delegate rose from her seat. A Morvani mathematician with compound eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian. Ambassador, she said, her voice carrying the precise clicks and harmonics of her species. I have calculated the parameters of your proposal, and I must inform you that it is mathematically impossible. Is that so? Sierra asked politely. The boundary expanse cannot be traversed, the Morvani continued. The gravitational interference alone would tear any known vessel apart within hours, and the radiation levels would kill biological crew members within days, and the spatial instabilities would make navigation completely impossible. She folded her segmented arms with the satisfaction of someone who had just proven a theorem. Whatever you are planning, you cannot escape Council space. Sierra smiled. And it was not a friendly smile, Counselor. Humanity has been told many things were impossible, she said. We were told we could not leave our planet, and we built ships to carry us to the stars. We were told we could not survive on other worlds, and we built domes and habitats in cities where a life should not exist. We were told we could not make peace with our enemies, and we found ways to understand each other anyway. She looked around the chamber, meeting as many eyes and sensors and other visual organs as she could. Perhaps the boundary expanse is impossible for you, she concluded. But we have learned not to accept impossible as a final answer. Another voice rose from the seats, deep and rumbling like stones grinding together. It was Scareth, the Veth ambassador, an elderly reptilian whose scales had faded to a dull gray with age. A word of caution to my colleagues, Scareth said slowly. I have studied these humans since they first reached beyond their home system, and I have learned one thing above all others. He turned his ancient eyes toward Sierra. They are very good at finding ways around obstacles that should have stopped them. Vorenthal made a dismissive gesture. Scareth speaks from sentiment, not logic, the High Arbiter declared. The humans are young and proud, and they do not yet understand how the galaxy truly works. He turned his attention back to Sierra. Ambassador, I urge you to reconsider, because if you leave this chamber today without accepting our offer, You will find that the universe is much less forgiving than you imagine. Sira had expected threats, but the cold certainty in Vaughthal's voice still sent a chill down her spine. She thought about the 14 colony worlds, the millions of humans who would have to uproot their lives, the dangers of crossing unknown space, and the possibility that the Marvani was right, and it really was impossible. Then she thought about the alternative. She thought about human children growing up under council oversight, never knowing what it meant to chart their own course among the stars. She thought about human scientists asking permission to wonder, human artists asking permission to create, human explorers asking permission to explore. She thought about everything that made humanity what it was, slowly ground away by 1,000 small compromises until nothing remained but obedience, High Arbiter. She said finally, "We thank you for your time and your counsel." She turned and began walking toward the chamber doors. "Ambassador Yun," Vaughanthal called out, his voice echoing through the vast space. "You are making a terrible mistake." Sira stopped at the threshold and looked back. "Perhaps," she acknowledged, "but it will be our mistake to make." She walked out of the chamber, and her delegation followed, and the doors closed behind them with a sound like the ending of an era in the seats above. Scareth watched them go and felt something he had not felt in centuries. It took him a moment to recognize the emotion. It was respect. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning when the sun was just rising over the city of Geneva. Ambassador Yun Sira was drinking her second cup of coffee when her assistant rushed into the office with a datapad clutched in trembling hands. "Ma'am, you need to see this," Park Jin-ho said, his young face pale with a mixture of excitement and fear. Sira took the datapad and read the words 3 times before she allowed herself to believe them. The Galactic Council, the ancient governing body that ruled over 47 species and countless star systems, had sent humanity an official invitation. They wanted Earth to join them. For 80 years, humans had been reaching out into the stars, building colonies and making friends wherever they went. And for 80 years, the Council had watched from a distance, never offering contact, never acknowledging that the young species from the blue planet even existed. Now everything had changed. Sira set down her coffee and looked at Jin-ho with steady eyes. "Get me a line to the president," she said calmly, "and tell the delegation team to pack their bags." 2 weeks later, Sira stood at the viewport of the diplomatic vessel Unity as it approached the Council's capital station. The station was enormous, a spinning ring of metal and light that hung in the darkness between 3 ancient stars. Billions of beings lived and worked there, representatives from every corner of the galaxy. And today, they would meet humanity for the first time. Sira adjusted her formal jacket and checked her reflection in the polished metal wall. She was 53 years old with gray streaks in her black hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of decades spent in difficult negotiations. She had brokered peace between warring nations, ended trade disputes that had lasted generations, and talked armed terrorists into surrendering without a single shot fired. But this was something different. This was the biggest moment in human history, and she carried the weight of 8 billion souls on her shoulders. "Ambassador, we're docking in 10 minutes, Jin-ho announced from behind her. Sira nodded without turning around. "How's the team?" "Nervous," Jin-ho admitted, "but ready." "Good," Sira replied. "Nervous keeps you sharp, and we need to be very sharp today." The council chamber was a vast circular room with seats rising in tiers toward a domed ceiling painted with stars. Representatives from dozens of species filled those seats, and Sira took a moment to study them as she walked toward the central speaking platform. She saw the Veth, reptilian beings with scales that shimmered like oil on water and eyes that tracked every movement. She saw the Morvani, insectoid creatures with compound eyes, and mathematical minds that could calculate orbital trajectories in seconds. She saw beings of crystal and light, beings of shadow and sound, beings that breathed methane, and beings that lived in seas of liquid metal, and above them all, seated on a floating platform of pure white stone, was the High Arbiter. His name was Voronthal, and he was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. His body appeared to be made of living crystal, faceted and gleaming, shifting through colors that had no names in human language. When he spoke, his voice resonated through the chamber like music played on instruments of ice. "Humanity," Voronthal announced, and the word echoed from every wall. "You have been observed, you have been measured, and you have been found worthy of consideration." Sarah kept her expression neutral, even as her heart pounded against her ribs. Worthy of consideration was not the same as worthy of respect. For 12,000 years, the Galactic Council has maintained order among the stars, Voronthal continued. "We have brought peace to warring species. We have shared technology and knowledge. And we have created a civilization that spans the galaxy." He paused, and his crystalline form pulsed with light. "Today, we offer humanity the chance to become part of this great work." Sarah heard whispers from her delegation behind her, but kept her eyes fixed on the High Arbiter. "We are honored by your invitation," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Please tell us more about the terms of membership." Voronthal made a gesture, and a holographic document appeared in the air before Sarah. It was written in the Council's standard language, which humanity had spent years learning to decode. As a new species, humanity would enter the Council as a provisional member, Voronthal explained. "This status comes with certain conditions designed to help you integrate smoothly into galactic society." Sarah began reading, and with each line, her stomach sank a little lower. Human expansion would be limited to systems approved by the Council. Human military vessels would be reduced in number and capability. Human technology, especially anything related to propulsion or energy generation, would be shared freely with all Council members, and any human colony world could be relocated if the Council determined it occupied strategically important space. "In exchange," Voronthal said, his voice warm and generous, "humanity will receive the full protection of the Council fleet, access to regulated trade routes, and guidance from older species who have walked this path before you." He spread his crystalline arms wide. "This is a tremendous opportunity for your young civilization, and we are confident you will see the wisdom of accepting." Sarah looked up from the document and met the High Arbiter's glowing eyes. She had negotiated with dictators who smiled while ordering executions. She had faced corporate executives who could destroy economies with a single decision. She knew what power looked like when it pretended to be generous. "High Arbiter," she said politely, "we thank you for this detailed proposal, and we request time to consult with our government before giving our formal response." Vorenthal's form flickered. A brief disruption that might have been surprise. "Of course," he said after a moment. "We will reconvene tomorrow at the same hour." As the human delegation walked out of the chamber, Sarah heard the buzzing whispers of dozens of species discussing what they had witnessed. Most of the sounds carried tones of amusement or condescension. The little humans were going home to think about it. How adorable. Sarah kept her back straight and her pace steady until the chamber doors closed behind her. Then she turned to her team with fire in her eyes. "Get me a secure line to Earth," she ordered, "and bring me every analyst we have, because we're going to read every single word of that treaty before the sun rises." Jinho nodded quickly. "What are you thinking, ma'am?" Sarah looked back at the closed doors and remembered the way Voronthal had smiled. If a being of crystal could smile, "I'm thinking they're not offering us a seat at the table," she said quietly. "They're offering us a leash, and I want to know exactly how tight they intend to pull it." The delegation worked through the night, and by morning, they had their answer. It was worse than Syrah had feared.